This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London. All of our podcasts are available from our website, www.sas.ac.uk.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Institute of Commonwealth Studies' third Peter Lyon Memorial Lecture. It's great to see so many people, and thank you for braving the cold to be with us. But I'm sure that our excellent speaker has drawn you in here, but also I'm sure the memory of Peter Lyon. We established this series in 2010 to commemorate Peter's tremendous contribution to the Institute of Commonwealth Studies. I don't need to say too much about him because I think most of you will have known him in some capacity. He joined the Institute in 1969. He served as academic secretary and reader in international relations here. And of course, for over 20 years, he edited Roundtable, and by all accounts, really, turned the journal around and made it, a major academic journal in the field. But of course, Peter was a remarkable person. He was an intellectual heavyweight, but he wore that learning extremely lightly. He probably knew more about the Commonwealth and its member states than pretty much anyone who's been associated with the Institute over the years. But he was such an inspirational person. I mean, for a young scholar coming to the Institute, giving a paper there in 28 Russell Square, he would give you something valuable, something intellectually valuable, but he'd also give you a boost, which is tremendously important when you're starting off. So we felt it was tremendously important that we commemorated him in this way. And we're extremely grateful to Sir Ronald Sanders for coming today and giving a lecture on the Commonwealth and China. Sir Ronald is a distinguished diplomat, businessman, scholar. He was twice Antigua and Barbuda's High Commissioner in London. He also served as ambassador to the World Trade Organization, and he served in a number of different capacities, both in the regional politics of the Caribbean and major international organizations like UNESCO. He was a member of the executive board between 1985 and 1987. And of course, when in 2010, the Commonwealth set up an eminent persons group to look at how the Commonwealth could be revitalised, it was natural for the Commonwealth to call on Sir Ronald Sanders as one of its eminent persons group. And for that reason, I think Sir Ronald is uniquely placed to talk about one of the major challenges to the Commonwealth in the coming years, which is the rise of China and China's political influence, and how that might affect the future of the Commonwealth. Of course, the future of the Commonwealth, will it survive, will it prosper, is not a new question. I was just at a witness seminar in the Foreign Office before I came here to launch a new book by Jill Bennett on British foreign policy since the Second World War. And one of the witnesses on the panel was Sir Kevin Tebbit, who was Permanent Under-Secretary at the Ministry of Defence at the time of the Iraq War. And Kevin Tebbit said that when he joined the civil service in 1969, the essay question he chose to answer on the examination was, does the Commonwealth have a future? So, China in coming years is going to be a major issue. It's not just the fact that Sir Ronald has this long engagement with the Commonwealth. He's also a tremendously incisive thinker. We're very privileged to have him as a visiting fellow here at the Institute, and he contributed one of the very best of our opinion pieces recently, which was on the theme of whether it's likely or desirable that there should be a Commonwealth free trade area, and Sir Ronald's answer was a decisive no. And the moment I saw that, I thought, I want to keep this in my back pocket, metaphorically speaking, for the next time I'm confronted with a really crazy Eurosceptic who wants to embrace the Commonwealth. And it obviously just wasn't me who thought it was a wonderful piece, because when the British government responded recently to the Foreign Affairs Committee's report into the future of the Commonwealth, they explicitly quoted Sir Ronald's opinion piece. We're very pleased to see that. So it's a great pleasure to have Sir Ronald with us today and to be able to introduce him, speaking on the theme, the Commonwealth and China, protecting values containing the dragon, question mark. Thank you.
When I was about to board a train to come here today, and I felt the bitterness of that cold, I said to my wife, this audience, if there is one, will either be a bunch of crazy people or people of extreme courage. I prefer to think that you are the latter. Thank you very much for coming. It's a great honor for me to be invited to give the 2013 Peter Lyon Memorial Lecture. I was privileged to know Peter and to benefit from his enormous knowledge and understanding of the Commonwealth. His writings on several aspects of the Commonwealth represent a great legacy to students of the Commonwealth and those who practice diplomacy in its cause. Peter was one of my mentors. He encouraged my early writings for the Round Table when he was its editor. And he also persuaded me to explore the Commonwealth more deeply. In this regard, I feel confident that Peter would have approved of this presentation tonight, which looks at the Commonwealth and China, and which tries to paint a picture of what that relationship looks like, the severe challenges that confront it in relation to the shared Commonwealth values of democracy and human rights, and particularly whether the interests of Commonwealth countries, all of them without exception, will prove to be greater than their commitment to Commonwealth values. The government of Sri Lanka controversially wants to host the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting, Chatham, later this year. Yet, when its United Nations ambassador was asked to comment on criticisms from Commonwealth organizations and governments of his government's unconstitutional impeachment of the country's Chief Justice, his response was, "What is the value of the Commonwealth?" Significantly, in May 2011, after a meeting between the foreign ministers of China and Sri Lanka over investigations by a United Nations panel into credible allegations that war crimes were committed at the end of Sri Lanka's civil war in 2009, the Chinese foreign minister gave tacit support to investigations being left entirely to the authorities in Sri Lanka. The Commonwealth Ministerial Action Group, CMAG, is the body charged with the responsibility of safeguarding Commonwealth values. In September last year, when CMAG contemplated placing the Maldives on its list for consideration under matters of interest, the Maldives government objected. And one response was, with the emergence of China and the economic decline of the West, the Commonwealth would be even more irrelevant in the next 10 years. For a poor country like Maldives, we could be better off out of the Commonwealth. In Fiji, where the military government is currently suspended from the councils of the Commonwealth, the head of the junta continues to violate the values and principles for which Commonwealth countries have collectively declared they stand. His most recent disdain for Commonwealth values was the rejection of a draft constitution prepared by an independent commission in favor of one being drafted by his Attorney General on his instructions. When Fiji's Commonwealth Pacific neighbors imposed various diplomatic sanctions on Fiji, China's second-ranked leader in 2012 praised Fiji's foreign policy orientation toward China and pointedly criticized the sanctions that were imposed on Fiji following the 2006 military coup in which the current Prime Minister, Frank Bainimarama, seized power. Anne-Marie Brady, a specialist on China in the South Pacific at the University of Canterbury, says China is now actively undermining efforts by Australia, New Zealand, and other Pacific nations to pressure Fiji to democratize. I made these three illustrations to show the tension, if not the conflict, that exists between the efforts of the Commonwealth to uphold its values and principles in its member states and the weakening of those efforts by China's assistance to those member states that run afoul of Commonwealth values. This is a dilemma that now silently confronts the Commonwealth and will trouble it in the coming decades. How does the Commonwealth uphold its declared values in its member states when the nation that is now one of the two most dominant powers in the world has a different attitude to democracy, human rights, and the rule of law, both within its own borders and internationally, and supports governments that discard these values? Although there's been little academic or official study or literature on China and the Commonwealth, China is very much the elephant in the Commonwealth room. It might be useful at this point to recall where China is today as a global power. China is now the world's #1 trading nation. Last year, it surpassed the United States. According to Bloomberg, US exports and imports last year totaled $3.82 trillion. By comparison, China's total trade amounted to $3.87 trillion. China also had an annual trade surplus of $231.1 billion, while the US had a deficit of $727.9 billion. Globally, China is also now the second largest economy after the United States, and its economic growth averaged 10% a year from 1978 through 2012, outstripping every other country in the world. China is also now said to have overtaken the World Bank as the world's biggest lender to other countries, developed and developing. One authoritative study says that the size of the Chinese market means that in time it will inevitably become by far the world's largest market. As a result, it will also assume the role of de facto template for most global standards and regulations. The size of its domestic market will also have the consequence that Chinese companies will be the biggest in the world. And if we are to accept Martin Jacques' study, in less than 50 years' time, Beijing will have assumed the status of the de facto global capital. China now also has $3.3 trillion in foreign reserves. It has an awful lot of money to spend on the things China wants. Given these realities, China and its government's policies have to be treated seriously and carefully. In the context of the Commonwealth, China has diplomatic and economic relations with 44 of the Commonwealth's 54 member states, including Fiji. It also has a keen interest in the other 10 Commonwealth countries because they each have diplomatic ties to Taiwan, which the Chinese government regards as lost territory, and whose return to Chinese sovereignty is its ultimate non-negotiable objective. The Taiwan issue with these 10 countries, mostly small states in Africa, the Caribbean, and the Pacific, is also one of the primary drivers of China's policies within these regions. Looking at China's relationship with regions of the Commonwealth, let's start with Africa. China is now Africa's single largest trading partner. Two-way trade grew from $10 billion in 2000 to $166.3 billion in 2011. Now that figure of $166.3 billion of trade with China and Africa compares with only $82 billion from the United States. It is reported that by 2011, cumulative Chinese direct investment in Africa had exceeded $15 billion with investment projects covering 50 countries. Significantly, reports also indicate that European countries, Africa's traditional trading partners and its former colonizers, have lost ground to China as their trade with the continent still remains at levels in 2008. Now, in addition to securing supplies of energy and raw materials, Chinese foreign trade policy is also geared toward opening new markets for Chinese export goods. But Africa has benefited as well. Chinese trade and investment in Africa has helped to spur consistently high economic growth between the years 2005 and 2011. The International Monetary Fund estimates a growth of 5.8% for sub-Saharan Africa as a result of that investment. The Commonwealth African countries that have benefited most from China's aid and investment are those that are endowed with raw materials and commodities in the extractive industries that China wants. 5 Commonwealth countries are among the top 6. However, every Commonwealth African country except 2 that have diplomatic relations with Taiwan has received aid and investment from China. It's noteworthy, incidentally, that the country ranked 9th of the top 10 beneficiaries of China's aid and investment is Zimbabwe, whose government withdrew it from membership of the Commonwealth in 2003 after it was suspended over elections that were assessed as not being free and fair. Now that African pattern is replicated in the South Pacific, home to 9 Commonwealth small states, including Fiji. Of the 9 Commonwealth South Pacific countries, 5 of them, including Fiji, recognize China. The 4 others are tied to Taiwan, an irksome reality for China, which insists on a one-China policy. Now, it's as difficult in the South Pacific as everywhere else in the world to clearly determine the exact amount of China's aid and investment. Nonetheless, picking through occasional public statements, it is estimated that China's annual aid to South Pacific countries is around $150 million. Much smaller than Australia's, which is about $400 million, but significant nonetheless, and enough to give China influence over those governments. China's trade with the 14 island states in the Pacific Island Forum has increased more than tenfold, from $121 million in 1995 to $1,229 billion in 2006. In other words, it's gone up 10 times. And the boosting of their economies is something, of course, for which they are immensely grateful. It is also noteworthy that in 2011, trade between China and Fiji alone totaled $172 million, 34% higher than the previous year. And Chinese investment in Fiji reached $100 million, giving the military junta comfort in continuing its undemocratic rule and its disregard for the rule of law. Turning now to the Caribbean region, where there are 12 Commonwealth Caribbean countries, China enjoys diplomatic relations with 8 of them, whereas 4 others are tied to Taiwan. China's trade with the 12 Commonwealth Caribbean countries in Suriname, which comprise the Caribbean Community and Common Market, grew from a paltry $20 billion in 1990 to $7.2 billion in 2010. 10 years, 20 million to 7.2 billion. As with the South Pacific, it's virtually impossible to quantify China's aid and loans to the Caribbean. Figures are not published by either the Chinese government or the Caribbean governments that are the recipients. They can only be estimated through announcements made from time to time about projects in individual countries. By doing these sums, it is clear that over the last 10 years, loans and grants to Caribbean governments by the Chinese government amount to billions of dollars. For instance, in 2010, a Chinese government official reported that China's direct investment to the region in 2009 alone was $8.6 billion. Now, apart from Trinidad and Tobago, Jamaica and Guyana, these countries are the countries with vast natural resources: forestry, oil, asphalt, bauxite, gold, uranium, diamonds, rare earth. The remaining 9 Commonwealth Caribbean countries with which China has diplomatic relations have no extractive industries. So why are they there? Well, they're there because of those countries, 4 have diplomatic relations with Taiwan. And since China is concerned that no country should have any interest in Taiwan, its only interest in these small countries is to effect, first, they're getting rid of Taiwan, but secondly, ensuring that in the United Nations and elsewhere, on the issues of human rights in China, on questions like Tibet, those countries vote exclusively with China. It is also known that Beijing has made it clear to Caribbean countries, the ones that it has diplomatic relations with, that they should not vote for a permanent seat for Japan when and if the UN Security Council's permanent membership is expanded. It will be interesting in the next few years to see whether China adds India to the list of countries it does not want to have a permanent seat on the expanded Security Council. With regard to Commonwealth countries in Southeast Asia, Singapore, Malaysia, and Brunei Darussalam, China is currently Singapore's 3rd largest trading partner, its 2nd largest source of tourist arrivals, and its top investment destination. In 2010, trade between the 2 countries was $74.5 billion, and rising. China is also Malaysia's biggest trading partner globally. In 2010, bilateral trade totaled $74.2 billion, an increase of 18.9% over the previous year. In 2010, the two countries also implemented a free trade agreement. Now, in respect of Brunei Darussalam, in 2011, bilateral trade amounted to $1.31 billion. May not sound like a lot, but it came from a low of $100 million just 10 years before, as China purchased increased supplies of oil. Therefore, China's importance to these three Commonwealth South Asian nations and its capacity to influence them cannot be overemphasized. But it is with the three Commonwealth neighboring states in Asia, and with India in particular, that China poses a major difficulty for the Commonwealth in the future. As is well known, India and China fought a bloody border war in 1962, and although talks have been going on since 1981 to settle their territorial disputes, described by one analyst as the longest and most futile negotiation process between any two nations in modern world history, territorial and maritime issues continue to fester. The analyst has observed about China and India that each views the other as a geopolitical rival. Booming bilateral trade has failed to moderate that rivalry. Nonetheless, China is India's biggest trading partner. That counts for something. In 2011, trade between the two countries reached a high of $73.9 billion. Although it declined in 2012, it is still a large volume, mostly in China's favor. At the end of 2011, the Indian embassy in China reported that Chinese companies had directly invested $555 million in India, while Indian companies had invested $447 million in China. So there is a mutually beneficial trade and investment relationship between China and India, even though it is haunted by border rivalries and security concerns, which so far have been kept in check. In respect of Bangladesh, China is now that country's largest trading partner. You know how often I say this, country's largest trading partner is China. And it has consistently extended its economic, military, and diplomatic assistance to Bangladesh. However, it is China's relations with Pakistan that appear to cause India great concern. Pakistan's bilateral trade with China in 2011 was estimated at $9 billion, a fraction of the trade between China and India. And Chinese investments in Pakistan were no more than $1 billion. Nonetheless, as Pakistan's relations with the United States have soured, China is reported to have become Pakistan's main arms supplier, selling it missiles, tanks, jet fighters, radar equipment, and submarines. Pakistan's recent decision to give the management of Gwadar port to the state-run Chinese Overseas Port Holdings this very month has caused India even more worry. Observers in India see China's support for Pakistan as a key aspect of Beijing's perceived policy of encirclement of India as a means of preventing or delaying New Delhi's ability to challenge Beijing's region-wide influence. One conclusion that can be drawn from all this is that while India is concerned about China in its national security interests, the government might be reluctant to offend China over matters of human rights and democracy in other Commonwealth countries. India might also be fearful of of pushing such Commonwealth countries more firmly into China's embrace. This might account for why India has not raised its voice so far in relation to Sri Lanka's inclusion on the CMAG agenda, or on the appropriateness of Sri Lanka hosting the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting later this year. Now, with regard to Sri Lanka itself, China was its biggest financier of economic development between 2009 and 2011, having provided loans of $1.2 billion in 2009, $821 million in 2010, and another $760 million by July of 2011. And here's the point. By comparison, the World Bank lent Sri Lanka a mere $105 million in 2010. I think we can conclude that Sri Lanka needs China more than it needs the World Bank. Now, the China Development Bank announced in June 2011 that it would finance infrastructure projects in Sri Lanka amounting to $1.5 billion over 3 years. But as a study done last year under the auspices of Safer World observes, China has been most helpful to the Sri Lanka government at the United Nations Human Rights Council, where China is said to have joined 29 others in passing a Sri Lankan authored resolution that commended the government's actions, congratulated it for liberating the North, and reaffirmed the principle of non-interference in matters which are essentially within the domestic jurisdiction of states. In June 2011, the Chinese delegation objected to the formation of an international monitoring mechanism, stating that China had total confidence in the capability of the government and people of Sri Lanka to resolve their own issues. And in September 2011, ahead of a UN HRC meeting, China's chief legislator publicly said, China will continue to support Sri Lanka's efforts to safeguard its national independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity. Now to the Maldives. That country is ironically both a member of the Commonwealth Ministerial Action Group and on its agenda for consideration in relation to a violation of Commonwealth rules. The Minister of Foreign Affairs publicly stated in September last year that the Maldives would leave the Commonwealth if it is not removed from CMAG's formal agenda. Now, more significantly, and here's the point, the Maldivian President's political advisor said that if the Maldives remained on CMAG's agenda, the government, I quote him here, should end our relationship with the Commonwealth and look to other relationships that reflect modern realities of the world. And that same week, where did the Maldivian president go? China. And to do what? To sign 3 agreements providing for Chinese assistance worth $500 billion. China is also now the single largest source of tourists for the Maldives, where tourism is the primary industry, accounting for close to 30% of the country's gross domestic product and approximately 60% of all its foreign exchange receipts. Now, I think from all that has been said in this presentation so far, it can be seen that China has become a significant player in all of the developing countries of the Commonwealth, sufficient to influence how they vote in international organizations, particularly on issues that matter to China. Also, because of China's declared policy of non-interference in the internal affairs of states and its own exposure to international criticism over democracy and human rights, China has continued to give support to some of these governments whose democracy and human rights performance is on the par at best. While the relationship between China and the governments of developing Commonwealth states appear comfortable based on the growing dependency of those governments on China for loans, grants, and investments, the relationship at the level of the local populations is not so smooth. Developing country governments welcome Chinese loans and grants for specific projects because they give those governments some space to utilize normal revenues to deliver goods and services for which they otherwise would not have any funds. Let's take a couple of Caribbean countries, for instance, where their debt to GDP ratio is well over 100%. In other words, everything they produce does not match the amount of debt they have. And debt servicing, in some cases, grabs as much as 70% of their income, with as much as 25% going to pay government salaries. That means they've got 5% of their income left to do everything else. Infrastructure development, medical facilities, police, you name it. So, why not take China's money? Particularly as it does not tie them to conditions of democracy, human rights, good governance, as do Western industrialized nations. But at the level of those local populations, China's aid and loan policies do pose problems. Problems that have erupted into protests and violence in some countries. Chinese aid and loans are highly tied, not only to Chinese firms for construction and materials, but even to the exclusive use of Chinese labor. More than one study says that many of those workers are prisoners and conscripts. For some projects, as much as 100% of the workforce is brought in from China. Therefore, while some of these projects are financed by Chinese loans that the recipient country's taxpayers must repay, few, if any, jobs are provided to local people, even in the context of high unemployment. As I speak to you, there is a hot dispute in Guyana right now, where a Chinese firm has been given the contract to build a government-owned hotel financed by a Chinese government loan. But all the workers, all, on the construction, will come from China. The Guyana Trades Union Congress has declared that the construction of the hotel without any Guyanese workers is an atrocity that must be stopped. Labor unions in Trinidad and Tobago, the Bahamas, and Barbados have also protested similar arrangements with the Chinese that allow for the importation and exclusive use of Chinese labor. Now, Chinese firms that enter many of these developing countries through aid and loan projects tend to remain in the country, setting up a local office and retaining the equipment that they brought into the country originally so that they become locally extremely competitive. They also get soft loans from China. This is money at less than 2% interest with a long maturity period. And on that basis, they are able to outbid local companies for construction projects. Inevitably, many of the workers stay behind after projects are complete. And with money loaned to them by Chinese banks, they open retail and wholesale outlets, importing products from China and putting local firms out of business. Incidentally, in the Caribbean and almost every small village you go into, there's a Chinese restaurant. In Africa and the Pacific, there have also been incidents of violence directed at Chinese operators by local workers over conditions of work. For instance, it's reported that in Zambia in 2006, in one mine, Chinese managers opened fire on workers protesting over back pay and working conditions, injuring several of them. A year earlier, 50 Zambians had been killed at the same mine by an accidental blast to the company's explosive plant. In 2010, at another mine, 2 Chinese managers were charged with attempted murder after opening fire on a group of employees protesting poor working conditions. Now, on the flip side of all that, as one authoritative study has pointed out, Chinese aid is allocated to building low-cost housing, schools and sports stadia, the provision of doctors and humanitarian aid, and scholarships, albeit to study in China. That's something Western industrialized nations have stopped doing in the Pacific, in the Caribbean, and in Africa several years ago. One might say they are now sowing what they reaped. The point is that governments of developing Commonwealth countries get loans and aid from China, which, while they are tied to benefits for China, do not impose conditions of democracy and respect for human rights. Many civil society organizations now fear that China's growing influence over domestic politics will act as a brake on any political liberalization and actually could help reverse democratic trends in some nations. I've talked about the developing Commonwealth. What about the developed Commonwealth countries and their relationship with China? In particular, Canada, Britain, and Australia. Of these 3 countries, Canada has the smallest economic relationship with China right now. But the Canadian Chamber of Commerce is keen to improve that situation, saying our country needs China, and Canada has the natural resources, high value-added goods, technologies, and services that China needs to power its remarkable ongoing development story. China is already Canada's 3rd largest trading partner and its 3rd export market. Using Canadian statistics in merchandise trade, Canada exported $17 billion in 2011 to China and imported $48.6 billion from China, making for total trade in that year of $65.6 billion. The Canadian Ministry of Foreign Affairs and International Trade asserts that it is clear that there is huge untapped potential to increase trade between China and Canada. China is also the 8th largest source of foreign direct investment into Canada. In 2011, that figure was $10.7 billion in comparison with Canadian investment in China of $8.3 billion. Canada, therefore, clearly has a keen interest in expanding and deepening its economic relations with China. Now, 3 years ago, the Prime Minister of Canada, 4 years ago, Prime Minister of Canada, Stephen Harper, declared that human rights was far more important than the mighty dollar. Since then, under pressure from his own private sector, he's been to China twice, leading trade delegations, and the Premier of China has been to Canada for a very successful visit. So, how will all this affect the Canadian government's attitude to human rights issues in China, and its attitude toward China if China continues to fund and support Commonwealth countries that violate Commonwealth values and principles? Well, your crystal ball is as good as mine, but we can judge that in the future. And let's turn to Britain. It has an even deeper economic relationship with China than does Canada. Chinese statistics show that trade in goods between China and Britain reached $63.1 billion in 2012, up 7.5% over 2011. Chinese firms also completed 10 investment, merger and share participation deals in Britain in 2012, at a value of more than $8 billion, exceeding the total value made in the 2009 to 2011 period. By the same token, British direct investment in China reached $18.1 billion in the period January to November 2012, making it the second in the European Union, only after Germany. There is a sense, therefore, in which the business communities in both Canada and Britain are driving the relationship with China. The consequence is that feeding the hunger for access to China's market may well have taken priority over issues of democracy and human rights. It is significant to me, for instance, that on Chinese New Year Day this year, when the Prime Minister of Britain, David Cameron, lauded the relationship between China and Britain and expressed his desire to see that relationship expanded, there was not a single word about human rights. In other words, shared interests might be more important than shared values. Now I come to Australia, which has a particularly interesting relationship with China. During a visit to China in April 2012, Prime Minister Julia Gillard said, and I quote her, "Our policy is not to contain. Our policy is to engage positively with China." This was shortly after Australia's total trade with China in 2010 reached $105 billion. That was the first year in which a single nation topped the $100 billion level for Australia. China is now Australia's largest two-way trading partner in goods and services, valued in the financial year 2011 to 2012 at $131.68 billion. China is also Australia's largest merchandise export market at $79.1 billion and the largest source of its merchandise imports at $44.7 billion. Now in that same financial year, Australia's service exports to China were valued at $5.87 billion. China is also Australia's largest source of foreign students, with more than 136,372 students studying in Australia on a student visa in August 2012. Incidentally, those students are more than the size of the population of any of the Eastern Caribbean nations. China's direct investment in Australia reached $13.8 billion in 2011, while by comparison investment in China remains at low levels of $6.3 billion or 1.9% of Australia's total foreign direct investment in 2011. Now again, it is left to be seen whether Australia's economic interests with China will take priority over any concerns that China's blindfolded policies on human rights and democracy might have on upholding democracy and human rights in Commonwealth countries. In reality, it is most unlikely, in my view, that any Commonwealth country would encourage any engagement between China and the Commonwealth as an organization. What is perceived as national interests of each of the governments of these countries would prohibit such action. Each of them would want to continue their own bilateral arrangements with China in pursuit of the maximum benefits they think they could each achieve. And China itself would hardly see any value in engaging with the Commonwealth as an organization, since in relation to both developed and developing Commonwealth countries, it bilaterally negotiates terms and conditions best suited to itself. In the case of small countries, of course, there isn't even any meaningful negotiation. In return for its aid and loans, China alone dictates the terms. Now, a marker should be put down here. It may well be that China is not actively trying to export its system of governance to developing Commonwealth countries, but its support for authoritarian regimes challenges the deepening of democracy and respect for human rights in any event. By giving support to authoritarian regimes, China not only places the rights of the people of these countries at risk. It also confronts the values for which on numerous occasions the Commonwealth has declared its stance. A recent study of democracy in the Commonwealth by a distinguished group, a study incidentally, that was done in this House by what was then the Commonwealth Policy Studies Unit, said this: the Commonwealth in recent years focused more decisively on the importance of democracy and the commitment to human rights as the main criteria for joining and indeed for continued membership. Membership of the Commonwealth bestows a level of democratic legitimacy. It means that a country is on the right side of history. And Secretary General Kamala Sharma emphasized adherence to these values when he said in the foreword to the 2011 CMAG report on its own reform the following words: by 2009, Commonwealth leaders recognized that the bar needed to be raised further, both in defining the Commonwealth's core values and in achieving adherence to them. I am confident that CMAG's strengthened role will enable the Commonwealth to further enhance its effectiveness as an organization of member states that not only believes in the importance of respecting and adhering to its core values, but also lives up to them. And this really is the issue now. How deep is the belief of Commonwealth governments in the importance of respecting and adhering to the Commonwealth's core values? And how many of them are really committed to living up to them? Are those beliefs and shared values greater than the interests that China offers to individual members? This, for me, is the challenge that now faces the Commonwealth. But how does the Commonwealth face up to that challenge? On the eve of the last Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting in Perth, the Foreign Minister of Australia, Kevin Rudd, who incidentally is a fluent Chinese speaker, underlined the importance of the recommendations of the Eminent Persons Group for more attention to be paid to human rights in the Commonwealth, by pointing to the fact that China, the world's fastest growing large economy, is not a democracy and has little disposition towards democracy. His analysis was correct then, and it remains correct now. It calls for Commonwealth leaders to recognize that reality and to ensure that the Commonwealth stands fast on democratic values, even if it means a Commonwealth that is made up of fewer member states than it now has. Given the fact that small Commonwealth countries do not have the leverage of their larger Commonwealth partners to bargain strongly with China, there also has to be a commitment of Commonwealth countries to give economic support to those small developing Commonwealth states and to advocate their cause actively and forcefully in the international community. Otherwise, they will have been made a gift to the People's Republic of China. Successive Chinese governments have displayed a remarkably practical and realistic approach to their international relations. If they see a Commonwealth of Nations that is a genuine coalition of democracies, they will find ways to adapt to working with them. Building a genuine Commonwealth of democracies is the task that now lies before its member states. In truth, the dragon cannot be contained, but with the political will, it might be constructively engaged. Thank you.
I think we just had a really excellent and genuinely important lecture. In a few minutes' time, my colleague Stuart Merle will offer a vote of thanks, but in the meantime, Sir Ronald has very kindly agreed to answer questions. I just ask you, I'm going to come out with a microphone. I'm sure a lot of people will want to say something. Please identify yourselves before you speak, and please keep your questions short and to the point. So.
Thank you. Daisy Cooper, a member of the Commonwealth Roundtable. Well, that was excellent. Thank you very much. That was really, really thought-provoking. One thing that the Commonwealth Secretariat does particularly well, some would perhaps be cruel enough to say the only thing the Commonwealth Secretariat does really well, is that it provides advice to some Commonwealth governments on how to negotiate the best contracts when, with extractive firms, and also it helps countries to negotiate maritime boundaries and things like that. Do you think that the that a time has come for the Commonwealth Secretariat to provide advice to some Commonwealth developing countries on how they negotiate contracts with China?
Daisy, I myself suggested that in the context of small Commonwealth countries, they do not have the capacity to negotiate with China. Most of them have nothing that China wants, except their vote at the United Nations and in other international organizations on the issues of Taiwan, Tibet, and other human rights questions. But the Caribbean countries form themselves into something called the Caribbean Community and Common Market. And they've agreed in that context to harmonize their foreign policy relations. I've suggested on more than one occasion that they should agree to negotiate with China collectively. And that they should, in that context, try to secure what they did with the European Union since 1973. And that is a series of treaties that govern their relationship, including, incidentally, workers coming into a country having to abide by the laws of the country, the regulations of the country, and therefore there would not be this large influx of Chinese workers taking jobs from local people. That has not happened. And it has not happened because the country, the Caribbean is divided, as incidentally is the South Pacific, into countries that support Taiwan and countries that support China. In that context, even though these countries have agreed, the Caribbean countries have agreed to coordinate their foreign policies and harmonize them, there is no coordination and harmonization on this issue. Each of them believes that by playing off China against Taiwan, they have more money to get. And in that relationship, in that circumstance, they take a very myopic and short-term view of this matter. Whereas, of course, China takes a much longer view of the matter. China knows that it's only a matter of time before it brings Taiwan back into its fold. And therefore, those countries that are now linked to Taiwan will be linked to nobody and totally exposed to China. And China will be dictating the terms for it. Now, I've said as much, taking that point a little further, that whereas there's an African, Caribbean, and Pacific group, made up now of 79 countries, that negotiate with the European Union for economic partnership arrangements, that Africa, the Caribbean, and the Pacific ought to do a similar thing with China, because then it would be even stronger. And were they to do something like that, the Commonwealth Secretariat would absolutely have a role to play. And that role would be precisely the role they play now in advising the African, Caribbean, and Pacific countries on how to negotiate best with Europe, by training their people and by providing them the resources that could help those negotiations. But frankly, At this point in our international relationship, I don't see a role for the Commonwealth in helping these countries to negotiate with China, simply because they themselves want to keep the negotiation at a bilateral level.
Ranjit Gunawardhan, a private observer here in that capacity. I would like to understand the motivation for your paper. I mean, who was it sponsored by? Was it the Commonwealth Institute for Studies, or was it somebody else? Because it seems to me that everybody seems to be bashing China left, right and centre. Is it the fact that the European Union and America's or other trade bodies have not been successful as the Chinese have? Because nobody twisted their arm. In relation to small nations, I can understand what you're saying. But in terms of Pakistan, you mentioned Sri Lanka and a whole host of other places, which they entered willingly. So you must understand at the same time, the European Union does not play a role in any of these places. And somebody has to come in, and this is about supply and demand. And this is a free economy, and the Chinese are operating on that basis and not really being held back by so-called human rights, as you rightly mentioned. But when you look at human rights, we in the UK, America, have been involved in rendition and a whole host of human rights abuses. So without finger pointing, there's always a finger pointing back towards the originator of these issues. So my question is that, what's the motivation here?
Thank you.
Well, I think you more or less answered your own question. But the one thing you've asked me is, what is my motivation? Pure scholarship.
Okay, that was it.
Thank you very much. It was a brilliant exposition, and we're all grateful. Richard Bourne, I'm at the Institute of Commonwealth Studies and various other places. My query really is, back in 2005, the G8 meeting in Scotland was talking a lot about providing a lot of aid for Africa. And there was talk then about a kind of Marshall Plan for Africa. And what I'm wondering, having listened to the facts and figures that you've deployed this evening, is whether in reality China has provided a Marshall Plan for Africa.
Well, I think you're right, Richard, that is in fact what's happened, and not only for China. If we take the Caribbean, for instance, we are traditionally known as the American backyard. After the end of the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union, and the need therefore, and the easing of tensions between those two countries, where the Caribbean was no longer a vital passageway for the shipment of weapons from the United States and to Europe, the Caribbean became completely abandoned by the United States. The amount of aid has dwindled every year, year after year. And the only importance of the Caribbean poses now to the United States is three. One is, it should not be a source of refugees, mostly from Haiti. It should not be used for trafficking drugs to the United States, even though the United States is the demand market and the supply market is in South America. And the third is that money laundering mustn't take place in tax evasion of American money. Apart from that, the Caribbean has no further importance to America. And the money that it has been spending, if one looks at the totality of its aid, is in what it calls crime and security. China is the country that is now providing the development assistance. And the remarkable thing for the Commonwealth is that whereas in the past there were Commonwealth scholarships from which countries in the Caribbean and the South Pacific and in Africa benefited, people came here to do their degrees and their postgraduate work and their research. China now offers far more scholarships to those countries than Britain does, for instance. So yes, the answer to your question is, if we can call it a Marshall Plan, or something that is akin to it, China has done that, whereas the G8 countries have failed to do so.
Nick.
Yes, Nicholas Watts, Commonwealth Human Ecology Council, amongst others. Incisive and persuasive, I found your talk, thank you very much. It raised a couple of questions for me, one of which is how we get to a smaller but more coherent Commonwealth. And the second, and relating to that, is your prognosis for Sri Lanka, if the Sri Lanka Chogan does take place, whether that is a crunch time for the Commonwealth. And you were quiet about Mauritius, obviously in 2015, the scheduled follow-up. If that is a chance for resurrection of a weakened Commonwealth, if Sri Lanka proves very, very difficult, or if Mauritius might be a possible future, sort of see further decline.
Well, let me declare my own position, a position which I've made public already. I write a weekly commentary, and I've stated this beyond the shadow of a doubt, but as far as I'm concerned, Chogan ought not to be held in Sri Lanka. My main reason for that is that I do not believe Commonwealth heads of government meetings are held for the convenience or the aggrandizement of a country. Commonwealth heads of government meetings are held for the good of the Commonwealth. And if there is controversy such that the Commonwealth will suffer from the location of a heads of government meeting, it ought not to be held there. And were I the Secretary General of the Commonwealth now, I would have already have looked for an alternative location. And I would have been saying to member governments now that given all that we know about Sri Lanka and all that is going on there, even as I speak, that this would not be the place for a Commonwealth heads of government meeting to be held, because it would be sending a signal that says we approve of this regime, that we, the heads of government of the Commonwealth, will sit under the chairmanship of the President of Sri Lanka. If we do that, we have, in my view, given up all that we say we stand for in the Commonwealth in terms of democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. And increasingly, I think, if the influence of China, which is blindfolded, as I said, on the issue of democracy, the human rights and the rule of law, encourages Commonwealth countries to depart from those values because it believes, and there's evidence to support it, that China will underwrite their regimes by giving them a check, then I believe the Commonwealth has to take strong account of whether it wants those members to continue to be part of this organization. The Commonwealth has only one value in the world, and that is moral suasion. It is the Commonwealth's, it is the perception that the Commonwealth stands for democracy, human rights, and the rule of law, and for the good of people, the citizens of those nations, that makes the Commonwealth different from any other international or multinational organization. It's not a trade organization, it's not an aid organization, it's not a development organization, it's none of those things. What it is a voluntary grouping of 54, we say 54, 53 countries that say we stand for these values. If it isn't that, then it is nothing. So in my view, if the Commonwealth is to remain true to itself, and if it is to serve a value for the people of its states, note I say people, not governments, for the people of its member states, then it must be true to its values, and those governments that violate them should be expelled. Or the Commonwealth will be nothing.
Thank you.
I'm Kayode Samuel. I'm at the Institute. I rather like the note on which you ended your presentation, which is to make a case for constructive engagement rather than, containment. In that regard, are we not being static about the way we see China?
Have we not always
being static? We seem to be looking at China as a static object, whereas the people that are being affected by China are going through some transition. The point I'm trying to make is that, are we also looking at internal issues in China? Is China also going through changes which might also eventually affect its international patterns of behavior? I think that is one area that we should be looking at. And to use your metaphor, perhaps we could also be looking at a dinosaur that could eventually also become, a dragon that could become a dinosaur, more or less.
Yeah. The question is, which do we do first? Do we wait for internal transition in China in the hope that its middle class will become so large and so vocal and so strongly in favor of democracy, human rights, and the rule of law that we will see overthrow of the existing system of government? Or do we concentrate on trying to ensure that the countries within the Commonwealth do not fall afoul of its own values because of the belief that they will be supported by China? Zambia is going to be an interesting experiment and test for that over the next few months, incidentally.
Hello, very interesting talk. A private citizen, Nicholas Kuhn. What I want to raise with you are two questions that beg themselves as you spoke. One is the hidden other behemoth, which is Russia. And people forget that China has a real fear of Russia and vice versa. And India has a very close relationship with Russia. And the Chinese fear that. So we always got to see the other side of the coin and not defending China's human rights record. But Russia's are lousy as well, because Putin's government. Okay. The second point is some of the Commonwealth countries you keep coming up with, and I agree with you, the principles of human rights and the rule of law. And only this week I heard a programme on the BBC about the rights of women in India, which are abused appallingly, and the rights of religious minorities in Pakistan. I can name lots of countries that are in the Commonwealth which have terrible human rights records in terms of the rule of law for their own citizens. I just want to know what your response to those 2 points are.
I'm not sure I understood the second part of what you were saying very clearly, but I'm sure somebody will translate it for me. But let me just say two things. I could have done this paper on the United States of America and the Commonwealth. Why didn't I? I didn't because the United States proclaims itself in favor of the same values that the Commonwealth stands for: human rights, democracy, the rule of law. So there isn't a clash between interests and values in the relationship with the United States. There is a conflict, as you would rightly point out, in the matter of values between the Commonwealth and Russia. But Russia doesn't have China's reach. Russia is not in every Commonwealth country. China is. And Russia is not in every Commonwealth country. In those Commonwealth countries where Russia has a presence, it certainly is not as involved as deeply in dictating terms, in doing economic projects, in influencing governments in the way that China is in every Commonwealth country today, without exception.
Okay, maybe the question would just like to clarify the second part of the question, if there was some doubt about it.
Let's put it another way. The second point is that you made a very good point that the Commonwealth, if it's anything, is a grouping of countries that stand up for human rights, social justice, and the rule of law.
That should.
Yeah. So why doesn't the Commonwealth clean up its own act? There are many countries within the Commonwealth, I named two of them, that have terrible human rights abuses of minorities. In one case, of religious minorities, like Christians in Pakistan, and the rights of women in India. Now, if we clean our own act up in the Commonwealth, we can dictate to the Chinese about their rights, which I don't agree with either, but this is a point. Could you answer that, please?
And you're absolutely correct. I would be the last person to say that Commonwealth countries are not without blemishes. There are several of them that are. But here's the difference about the Commonwealth. At least the Commonwealth has set up machinery for examining persistent and serious violations of its values among its member states. I know of no other organization of the scope of the Commonwealth that has a similar mechanism. Now, the problem with that mechanism, which is the Commonwealth Ministerial Action Group, is up until 2011, the heads of government meeting in Perth. What had happened with the group is it tended to look at violations only in terms of unconstitutional overthrows of government, and had limited itself to that activity. It has been highly criticized by many people, including some in this room, for limiting itself in that way. And when the Commonwealth Eminent Persons Group was considering all of these things, one of the recommendations we made, well, two, was that the Commonwealth Ministerial Action Group had to go beyond just the unconstitutional overthrow of government in terms of cleaning up the act, as you put it, in several Commonwealth countries. We suggested a number of mechanisms. One of them was having a human rights council in each Commonwealth country. We already observe elections, for instance, but we said we had to go beyond that, to not only observing them when the elections are called, but to looking at the entire process of the election machinery, including setting electoral boundaries, how you appoint commissioners, what the role was that they were playing, and to go into these countries much earlier than when elections are to be held, to see if that process was truly democratic. We also suggested that there should be a commissioner for democracy, human rights, and the rule of law, independent of the Secretary General and independent of the Commonwealth Ministerial Action Group, so that there would be a body that could look at human rights violations in member countries independently and make recommendations about doing something about it. The heads of government in 2011, by consensus, rejected that proposal. In my view, it was a big mistake. And in my view, the time is going to come in the Commonwealth when such a commissioner or a mechanism like it will have to be appointed if we are serious about cleaning up what's happening in Commonwealth states. I am encouraged, however, by the fact that increasingly countries are turning to the Commonwealth to observe their elections, and that it is Commonwealth observation of those elections that give them a stamp of legitimacy. Right now, within the Commonwealth Secretariat itself, it is looking at accusations about anti-democratic behavior in Zambia. That is a big step. We will see where it goes, but the point is that that is happening, and it is happening in no other organization. So, if anything commends the Commonwealth in my view, limited as it may be, it is the work of the Commonwealth Ministerial Action Group, which I hope will grow stronger and not weaker in the coming years.
Thank you very much. I'm going to ask Stuart Mull to offer a vote of thanks.
Thank you very much, Philip, and I have three pleasurable tasks. First, as chairman of the Round Table, the Commonwealth Journal of International Affairs, to associate my organisation with tonight's memory of Peter. Secondly, to thank Sir Ronald for what has been an excellent lecture. And third, to point the way to the bar. So if I can deal with each of those in turn. As Philip has said, Peter Lyon was inseparable from the life of the Institute of Commonwealth Studies for the best part of 40 years. And in the same way, his life was interwoven with the Round Table. And I think that he began writing for the Round Table a few years after he took up a post in the ICS. And of course was an editor of the Round Table, the longest serving editor so far, having served for 21 years in that position. And so for most of Peter's professional life, the ICS and the Round Table were the twin pillars that allowed him to traverse the Commonwealth and to move between academic study and policy development. And I think it's highly appropriate that the Round Table's memorial to Peter should be a prize we give annually for the best policy-orientated article in the journal in the course of the year, and that it should be alongside this particular annual lecture that is organised by the Institute of Commonwealth Studies. And then that leads us to our lecturer tonight, because how appropriate a choice that Sir Ronald should be the lecturer, because he too straddles these two institutions amongst many, many others, but as a member of the Round Table's International Advisory Board, a frequent contributor to our pages, as well as his position in the ICS. And Ron talked about some of his personal connections with Peter, which I know were very strong, and I was thinking on, for my own part, what might have been some of the many issues on which I know that Peter and Ron would have been of like mind. I know they would have shared frustration at the slowness to act that is sometimes endemic in the Commonwealth, sometimes the lack of leadership that is apparent, and the failure of the organisation on occasions to live up to its potential, let's put it that way. There are many other instances. They had shared a mutual passion for small states. They have always promoted the importance of civil society in an unofficial Commonwealth, and so on. And in particular, I think both saw it very important that the Commonwealth set itself, understands its global setting, understands its place in a multilateral and multi-dimensional world. And Ron has given us tonight a typically trenchant and thought-provoking and powerful presentation. And he's exposed some of the principal hazards and challenges of what is the new global reality. And he's posed a question to which he expects, I know, the Commonwealth to respond. Will shared interests in relation to China trump shared values? And it's very interesting in our question and answer that we began to see some of the things that might come out of that continuing debate. Now, there was only one point when I found Ron unconvincing, and that was when he was asked on his motivation, and he said, pure scholarship. Now that, to me, and to all those that know Ron, doesn't really sound as though pure scholarship will be the end of this debate as far as Ron is concerned. I can see him wanting to be part of this and wanting to continue this debate right the way through to policy development, travelling that very same road that Peter travelled backwards and forwards between the two in the many, many years that he worked for the Round Table and for the Institute of Commonwealth Studies. So I thank you, Ron, for what has been a wonderful lecture, and I thank you for raising these issues. The first time I've heard them raised in a specific Commonwealth context, and I think that's tremendously important and a tremendously important contribution to the memory of Peter Lyon. And so in asking you to thank Ron in the normal way, in the traditional way, I also remind you that a drink is awaiting for you just over there. Thank you.